Honestly, this is a recipe I created myself. It just came to me one day in my own kitchen. My sister said that into a national morning show camera and held up a cookbook with her own name on it. The recipe was our grandmother's peach pie. I'm the older sister, 2 years older than Renee, and I'd watched Grandma make that pie 100 times. A few million people eating breakfast believed my sister invented it. I stood 3 rows back with my coat still on and felt the floor tilt. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I reached into my bag, because in that bag was a single recipe card. Flour-stained at one corner, written in my own hand from my grandmother's mouth the last autumn she was alive, and dated, notarized, and photographed 7 years before any cookbook existed. Renee didn't know that card existed. She thought the recipe lived only in her mouth now, attached to her name. She was glowing. She had no idea what it would prove the moment I laid it on the counter. Let the kettle warm. I want to tell you this slowly. This one's for the nights the house is too quiet, when the people who share a name with you take the one thing that was never theirs and smile while they do it. So tell me, if someone called the most loving thing your family ever made their own invention on live television, would you have stayed quiet in the dark or walked into the light? Now, let me tell you how it began. I'm the older sister, 2 years older than Renee, which, when we were small, felt like a lifetime, and later felt like nothing at all. We grew up in a narrow house with a wide kitchen, and the kitchen was where my grandmother lived. Not lived as in slept. She had her own little place 2 streets over, but lived as in was most herself. Grandma Della. She came over most afternoons, and she cooked the way some people pray, with her whole body, and a kind of patience the rest of the world had forgotten. My mother worked doubles. My father came and went, and then mostly went. So the warm center of our childhood, the place that smelled like something good, was always 30 minutes from being done, was Grandma Della at that stove. I want to give you one small picture, because it tells you everything about why this pie mattered more than a pie should. When I was 9, I had a bad year. The kind of year a child can't name, and the adults are too tired to notice. And Grandma Della, without ever once asking me what was wrong, started teaching me to bake. Just me. Renee was little and wanted to be outside, and that was fine. That was right for her. But me, she pulled up onto the step stool beside her, and she put my hands in the flour, and she taught me to feel when dough was happy and when it needed rest. She'd say, "You don't rush a good thing. A good thing tells you when it's ready." I thought she was talking about pie. It took me 30 years to understand she was talking about me. That kitchen, those afternoons, were the first place anybody made me feel like I was worth slowing down for. So, when I tell you the peach pie was the center of all this, understand that the pie was just the visible part. The pie was love I could hold in my 2 hands. Let me tell you about the first pie I ever ruined, because that afternoon is the whole reason I understood, years later, what was being taken from me. I was maybe 10, and I'd watched her long enough to think I'd graduated. I wanted to make the peach pie alone, to surprise her, to be the one who'd learned it. So one Saturday while she napped in the front room, I tried, and I rushed every step she'd told me never to rush. I didn't let the peaches weep. I didn't rest the dough. I cranked the oven hot, because hot meant fast. And what came out was a sad, gray, weeping wreck. The crust split, the filling ran out the side like the pie was crying, the whole kitchen smelling of burnt sugar and my own impatience. I sat on the floor and cried over it, because at 10, a ruined pie feels like proof you ruin everything. And Grandma Della woke up and found me there, and she didn't scold me, and she didn't laugh. She got down on that hard floor next to me, 80 years and her knees and all, and she looked at the wreck and she said, "Now you know. You can't steal a thing from its own time. You tried to take the pie before the pie was ready to be taken, and it knew. A thing made the wrong way always knows. I remembered that sentence 30 years later, standing 3 rows back in a television studio, watching my sister try to take a thing before it was hers. A thing made the wrong way always knows. Grandma had told me how this would end when I was 10 years old, sitting on the floor in burnt sugar. I just didn't have the rest of the story yet. The peach pie was her masterpiece. Everybody who ever ate it said so. It wasn't fancy. That was the secret of it. It was the opposite of fancy. It was a thing you couldn't quite copy from watching, because the magic was in the parts you'd never think to write down. A pinch of black pepper in with the sugar. Just enough that you'd never name it, but you'd miss it if it were gone. Peaches cut a certain thickness and salted, and left to weep for exactly the right while. A crust she made with half butter and half something else she'd never say out loud at a church potluck. People begged her for that recipe for 40 years, and she'd just laugh and say, "It's in my hands, honey. I can't give you my hands." And it was true. It really did live in her hands and in nobody else's, until the last autumn when her hands started to shake. I need to tell you about that autumn, because it's where the card comes from, and the card is the whole story. Grandma Della was 81, and the doctor had started using careful words. She knew before they did, the way her generation always knew. And one Sunday in October, with the light going gold, and early the way it does when the year is letting go, she called just me over. Not Renee. Me. She said, "Sit down. I'm going to talk, and you're going to write." And for 3 hours, at that wide kitchen table, she made the peach pie out loud, slow, every step, every secret, the pepper and the salt and the weeping peaches and the thing in the crust. And I wrote it all down on an index card in my own careful hand, and when a peach slipped and left a smear and flour dusted the corner, she said, "Leave it. That's how you'll know it's the real one." Flour-stained, she meant it to be. At the bottom, she had me write the date, and then she did something I didn't understand at the time. She said, "Now, you take that to a notary, and you make them stamp it, and you take a picture of it too, because the recipe is the only thing I've got worth leaving, and I want it left to the one who'll keep it kind." I thought she was being dramatic. I thought it was an old woman's worry. I went anyway, that very week, because you didn't argue with Grandma Della. I took the card to a notary in a strip mall, a bored young man who notarized the date and my signature without ever knowing he was witnessing anything that mattered, and I photographed the card on my own kitchen counter, in good light, both sides. And here's the small thing she made me do that I want you to hold on to, because it comes back. She didn't just want one copy of the picture. She made me email the photographs to myself and to her old account that my mother still has the password to, so that, she said, it lives in more than one place, the way a true thing should. I thought that was paranoia. It wasn't. It was a woman who'd watched her own family her whole life, laying a second wire in case the first one got cut. And then I put the card in a stiff envelope, and I put the envelope in a drawer, and I did not think about it as a weapon. I want to be honest with you the way I'd want to be honest if you were really sitting here. It was never a weapon. It was a relic. It was the closest thing I had left to her hands. Nobody armed me. My grandmother armed me on a cold October afternoon, and neither of us knew it, except maybe she did. Maybe she knew exactly. She passed that winter, quiet in her sleep, which is the only mercy that family ever caught. And here is the part that still surprises me when I say it out loud. At the funeral, it was Renee who cried the loudest. Renee, who hadn't been in that kitchen since she was small. And I remember standing there thinking, let her. Grief isn't a competition. We all loved her our own way. I had no idea I was watching the first scene of the thing that was coming. Let the years turn. 3 of them. Renee, you have to understand, was the bright one. The one rooms turned toward. She was charming the way some people are athletic. It was just a thing her body did. She'd tried a dozen things and finished none of them, and the family loved her for the trying in a way they'd never quite loved me for the finishing. That's an old wound, and I won't pick at it too hard, but it's why nobody blinked when Renee suddenly got into cooking. She started a little social media thing, pretty videos in a pretty kitchen, and the family was so proud. Finally, Renee found her passion. And one afternoon she called me, sweet as anything, and asked if I still had any of Grandma's old recipes lying around. Lying around, like they were junk mail. I should have heard it. I want you to know that I've gone back to that phone call 1,000 times. But she was my sister, and she was grieving too, I thought, and the recipe wasn't a secret from family. It was a secret from the world. So I made the peach pie for her one Sunday, and I walked her through it, the pepper, the salt, all of it, with my hands in the flour and hers taking notes on her phone, and I felt, God help me, happy. I thought we were keeping Grandma alive together. I thought I was sharing my grandmother's hands. She posted that pie within the month. No credit. That stung. But I told myself she was new. She didn't know the etiquette. And anyway, who credits a grandmother in a recipe video? The pie did well. Then it did very well. Then it did the thing that pies are not supposed to do. It went somewhere, the algorithm took it, and overnight, my sister was the peach pie girl. And a literary agent slid into her messages, and there was a word in our family suddenly that had never been there before. A word like a struck bell. Cookbook. I want to slow down here, because I need you to feel the next part, the way I felt it, which was slow, and then all at once. At first I was glad. I told myself I was glad. My sister was building something. Finally. And if Grandma's pie was the foundation, well, wasn't that beautiful? Wasn't that Grandma reaching out of the ground to give one more gift? I helped her. That's the part I can barely stand to say. I gave her 3 more of Grandma's recipes for that book. The cornbread, the apple butter, the Sunday gravy. Over coffee at my own table, freely. Because she was my sister, and I am apparently a person who has to learn the same lesson several times before it takes. The first time it went past stinging and into something colder was a magazine. A real one, glossy, the kind they fan out on a coffee table to be seen reading. They ran a feature on Renee. The self-taught sensation, it said across 2 pages. My sister in a clean white kitchen that wasn't ours, holding the peach pie like a newborn. And in the body of it, where a reporter had asked her where her gift came from, Renee had said something that I read 4 times, standing in the grocery checkout line with my cart full of someone's birthday. She said, I like to think my late grandmother's spirit is guiding me. Her spirit, not her hands, not her recipe, not her name, Della, which would have cost Renee nothing to print and would have meant everything to the woman it belonged to. Just a spirit, a vague, warm ghost hovering approvingly over Renee's own genius, close enough to bless her, and too dead to correct her. I put the magazine back on the rack face down, the way you turn over a photo of someone who's hurt you. And I drove home with my hands at 10 and 2, and I thought, she's not borrowing it anymore. She's editing Grandma out and keeping the glow. And I told no one. Because what was there to say that wouldn't sound like jealousy in a checkout line? It got worse. And it got worse in a way so small that I almost let it pass. Which is how these things win. There was a photograph our family loved. The 4 of us at Grandma's 80th birthday. The last good one. Grandma in the middle with frosting on her thumb, and me beside her with my arm around her shoulders, because I was always the one close enough to steady her. When the cookbook publicity started, Renee's team needed a family heritage image for the press kit, something to sell the wholesome story. And the photo that went out to the press, I found it on the agent's website, was that one. Except it wasn't. They'd cropped it. They'd cropped it down to Renee and Grandma. Just the two of them. Warm and golden. The perfect grandmother and granddaughter heirloom story. My arm was still in the original. My hand still on Grandma's shoulder. In the version they sent the world, my hand had become an anonymous blur at the edge. A stranger's arm, cropped almost out. The way you'd crop out a passing waiter. I sat looking at that for a long time. It's one thing to take a recipe. It's another thing entirely to take a recipe and then reach back into a photograph and scissor out the only person who was actually there, so the lie would photograph cleaner. That was the day I understood it wasn't carelessness. You don't crop carefully by accident. Somebody had looked at my hand on my grandmother's shoulder and decided it didn't fit the story. And clicked. And then, because I am the kind of person who can't leave a sore tooth alone, I went looking for the pre-order page that night, the one the publisher had put up, the one my mother had already shared with 3 party emojis. And there it was, the cover mock-up, my sister's name in gold across the top. And underneath it, in the little description box meant to make you click buy. A single line about how this collection was born from an evening alone in a quiet kitchen when a recipe simply arrived. An evening alone. There was no evening alone. There was a Sunday in October with the light going gold, an 81-year-old woman talking for 3 hours, and a granddaughter writing it down. They had not just removed me from the photograph. They had written me out of the origin story and replaced the truth with a fairy tale about a woman alone, touched by inspiration, owing nothing to anyone. I read that line and I understood, finally and completely, that this was not going to stop on its own. A thing that has rewritten its own beginning doesn't suddenly tell the truth at the end. It only gets bolder, all the way up to a national stage, until somebody who was actually there puts a witnessed page down on a counter under good light. I closed the laptop. I did not buy the book. And I went and checked for the first time in 3 years that the envelope was still in the drawer. It was. The book got a deal. A real one. A real publisher. An advance with a number on it that made my mother cry at Thanksgiving. And the title of that book, I'll never forget the moment Renee said it, glowing at that Thanksgiving table, the title was Made from Scratch, My Original Recipes. My original. And down the length of that table, every face turned to Renee, shining proud, and not one of them looked at me. I was, as ever, the one who'd helped in the kitchen, the reliable surface you set the good things on without thanking the table. I didn't say anything at Thanksgiving. I want to be honest about that, too, because it's the part where, if you've ever been the quiet older one, you'll feel your own face go hot. I sat there, and I let it happen, because making it a scene at the holiday would have made me the villain. Would have made me bitter, jealous, the sister who couldn't be happy for the sister. I knew exactly how it would be told. So I passed the rolls, and I said the book sounded wonderful. And I drove home, and I sat in my car in my own driveway, and I let myself feel it all the way down. I'm going to let myself feel it here too, with you, just for a moment, because rushing past the hurt is how you let it own you. It wasn't the money. I want to say that clearly because people always think it's the money. I didn't want her advance. It was that she was about to put my grandmother's hands, those gold October afternoons, that, leave it, that's how you'll know it's the real one, that whole secret, tender world, into a book and stamp the word original on it like a brand on a steer. She was going to take the one inheritance Grandma cared about, the thing she'd specifically said she wanted, left to the one who'll keep it kind. And she was going to sell it as a thing she'd dreamed up alone in a clean apron. And the worst of it, the thing that sat on my chest at night, was that everyone would believe her. Because Renee was the bright one, and I was the furniture. And that is just how the math of our family had always worked. If you've ever watched someone take the realest thing you have and be believed about it over you, you already feel this in your chest right now, and I see you. Stay with me, because the furniture had a photograph. There was one person, though, who didn't quite turn all the way toward the light, and I have to tell you about her, because she's part of how this ended. My great-aunt Marion, Grandma Della's younger sister, the last of that generation, 80-something and sharp as a tack and only half-deaf in the ear, she pointed at you on purpose. Marion had been in that kitchen too, in the old days. She'd eaten 40 years of those pies. And at that same Thanksgiving, while everyone was glowing at Renee, I caught Marion not glowing. She was looking at her plate. Later, while I was doing the dishes nobody offered to help with, she came and stood next to me with a dish towel and dried, slow, and she said, "Lo," just to me. I had a slice of that pie Renee made for the cameras. Off one of those little videos, she brought it round. She dried a plate. Della put pepper in that pie, a whisper of it. You'd never name it, but you'd miss it. She set the plate down. Renee's didn't have the pepper. And then she looked at me with those old, clear eyes and said the thing that I carried all the way to the studio. Della taught somebody that pepper, and it wasn't Renee. She knew. She didn't know about the card. Nobody did. But she knew in her tongue, in 40 years of Sunday afternoons, that the story being sold was missing the one ingredient that made it true. I didn't tell her what I had. I just dried my hands and said, "No, it wasn't Renee." And Marion nodded once, like a woman filing something away, and went back to the table. I want you to remember Marion. She comes back when it counts. Here's where it built toward the bright, cold room. The book had a launch, and the launch had a centerpiece, a live segment on a national morning show. You know the kind. The two hosts on the couch, the segment after the weather, a celebrity-adjacent guest with a new thing to plug. My sister was going to make the peach pie live on a national morning show, in front of a few million people eating breakfast, and call it hers. The family was beside themselves. There was a group chat. My mother sent the date and the time and a row of those little party emojis and added, "Let's all be there for Renee. She made it." She made it. 2 words doing so much quiet damage. I almost didn't go. I want you to know how close I came to staying home. Because here's the trap that people like me live inside. Being furniture is at least safe. Furniture doesn't get called bitter. Furniture doesn't get told it's jealous, that it ruined the family's big day, that it could never just be happy for anyone. The cost of staying quiet was only my own slow erasure, and I'd been paying that bill my whole life. I knew how to pay it. I could pay it in my sleep. To walk into that studio, with the envelope, was to risk being the one who made it ugly. I stood at my kitchen counter, the same counter where I'd photographed that card 7 years before. And I held the stiff envelope, and I thought, don't. Just go and clap and let her have it. Don't make it ugly. And then 2 things happened in the same quiet hour, and between them, they put my coat on me. The first was that I thought about a gold October afternoon, and an old woman who'd said, very deliberately, take it to a notary, because she'd known. She had known, not the details, not the camera, not Renee, but she'd known her family well enough to know that the recipe would need a witness someday. And she'd made me that witness on purpose. I had spent 3 years thinking I was failing her by not stopping this. Standing at that counter, I finally understood that she'd given me everything I needed to stop it, years ago, and that the only way to fail her now was to leave the card in the drawer. And the second thing was the phone. It buzzed while I stood there, and it was Marion. Just one line, in the careful all caps, an old woman types in, Are you going tomorrow? Someone who was there should be in that room. Someone who was there. She didn't know about the card. She just knew, in her bones, that a true thing was about to be sold false in a bright room, and that the only defense a family like ours had ever had was a witness who refused to look away. I texted her back one word: yes. And I picked up the envelope, and I checked that the card was in it, and the notary stamp, and the photographs, and I drove to the city in the dark before dawn. The studio. I told you a little. Let me give it to you whole now, because I lived every second of it. I told the producer, a kind, harried woman with a headset, when I'd called the day before, only that I was Renee's sister and I wanted to surprise her by being in the audience. Which was true. They sat me 3 rows back and 2 seats down, having gotten herself there on a 6 a.m. senior shuttle, and a stubbornness older than the building, was Marion, in her good coat, her purse in her lap like a small fortress, watching everything with those clear, old eyes. She caught my hand once, in the dark before the lights came up, and squeezed it, and didn't say anything, and let go. I watched them mic Renee, watched the makeup person dust her face, watched her laugh too brightly at something a host said. She was nervous and she was radiant, and for 1 second I almost lost my nerve again, because she was my baby sister and I had taught her to bake. Then they counted down from 5 on their fingers, and the lights came up to full, and the host turned to camera and said, "We are so excited to have a brand new voice in American baking," and my sister smiled and the segment began. She made the pie. My hands had taught her hands, so it was, of course, perfect. And I want you to understand what those few minutes felt like, sitting 3 rows back with the envelope in my lap, because this is the part nobody tells you about being the one who knows. I had a thing in my bag that could end this with one motion, and I had to sit perfectly still and watch the lie get built brick by brick in real time, smiling for the camera that occasionally swept the audience. Every confident word out of her mouth pulled the wire tighter. There was a moment she said, into the lens, "The trick is patience. You have to let the fruit tell you when it's ready." And I felt my whole face go cold, because that was Grandma's. That was, word for word, a thing Della said to a 9-year-old on a step stool. And Renee was saying it like she'd invented patience. Like the dead woman who taught it to her was a spirit somewhere being grateful. Marion, 2 seats down, made a small sound in her throat. I did not move. I have never in my life held so still while everything in me stood up. And the host, charmed, leaned in at the end and asked the question that hosts ask. So where did this incredible recipe come from? And I held my breath, because there was still a door open. There was still a version where she said my grandmother's name, where she said her sister taught her, where I could have folded the envelope back into my bag and clapped with the rest, and driven home, and we'd have been a family. The door was open for 1 more second. She closed it. She looked into the camera, that easy, bright smile, and she said, "Honestly, this is a recipe I created myself. It just came to me one day in my own kitchen." And the host said, "An original," and held up the book, made from scratch. And the little audience clapped, and somewhere a few million people eating breakfast believed it. This is the part you came for. I'll tell it to you exactly the way it happened, because I've replayed it enough to know it's true. I did not stand up and shout. I have never once made it loud. I made it quiet. They cut to a commercial break right after the host held up the book. 90 seconds of dog food and car insurance, and that 90 seconds was the door my grandmother had built me 3 years before in a strip mall notary's office. I rose from the 3rd row, and beside me, Marion rose too, slow on her cane, and I almost told her to stay. And then I didn't, because someone who was there should be in that room. Those were her words, and she meant to be in it. I walked down the side aisle, calm, my coat still on, Marion's hand light on my elbow, and I caught the eye of that kind, harried producer with the headset, and I said the only sentence I had rehearsed. I said, "I'm her sister, and before you go back live, there's a photograph your show needs to see, for your own protection." For your own protection. I watched that land. A producer on a live national show hears those words and a different part of their brain switches on. She walked me to the edge of the set, behind the cameras, where Renee stood sipping water, glowing, coming down off the high of it. The light back there was different. Work light, gray and honest, the light they don't point at the guests. And the room got slow, the way rooms do at the hinge of a thing. I could hear the production noise drop, a stage manager counting something down somewhere, a far-off voice in a headset, Renee's little laugh dying in her throat as she registered that I was there, and behind me, the old woman, leaning on her cane, watching her great-niece with no expression at all. And I took the stiff envelope out of my bag, and I did not hand it to Renee. I handed it to the producer. I slid out the recipe card first. The real one, flour-stained at the corner, my grandmother's words in my careful hand, and I laid it flat on the prop counter where the empty pie pan still sat, and I smoothed the soft creases with the side of my hand, the way you smooth a tablecloth before something important is set down. Then I laid the notary page beside it, the stamp, the date, my signature, witnessed and sealed 7 years before any cookbook existed. And then the photographs, dated in the metadata, both sides. And I said, in a voice I kept very level, looking at the producer and not at my sister, "This recipe was dictated to me by our grandmother, Della, in October 7 years ago. It was written in my hand, notarized that week, and photographed. The pie your guest just called her own original creation has a paper trail older than her cookbook. I'm not here to ruin a morning show. I'm here so that when this comes out, and it will, you can say you knew before you put it back on the air. The choice of what to do with that is yours." And then Marion, who had not been asked, who answered to nobody, leaned forward over that prop counter, tapped the flour-stained card once with one old finger, and said to the producer in her dry, clear voice, "I'm Della's sister. I ate that pie for 40 years. There's pepper in it. Ask your guest what the secret ingredient is. Watch her not know." And the producer looked at Marion, 80-something in her good coat, and you could see it on her face, that a thing with a notary stamp is paper, but a thing with a living 80-year-old witness who was there is a different order of trouble entirely. I have thought a great deal about why I spoke to the producer and not to Renee. It's because I was done speaking to Renee. You can't argue a person out of a thing they need to be true, but you can lay the truth on a counter, in good light, in front of someone whose job depends on it, and let it do its quiet work. That's the whole of it. I didn't make a scene. I made a record. Renee saw the card. I watched her see it. I watched her recognize her own grandmother's words in her own sister's handwriting, dated and stamped and impossible. And her face. I'm not going to pretend I didn't feel something, watching her face do what it did. The smile went first. Then the color. Then this slow, dawning, sinking understanding, the look of someone watching a stage set she'd built, realize it was made of paper. She said my name once, just my name, like a question, like a little girl. And I didn't say anything cruel. I just held her eyes and I let the silence be the answer, and the silence said, "I taught you these hands, and you stamped the word original over the only person who ever slowed down to teach you anything." The producer looked at the card for a long time. Then she looked at the old woman who'd eaten 40 years of that pie. Then she looked at Renee and asked her, quietly, not unkindly, what the secret ingredient was. And Renee, who had made that pie on camera not 20 minutes before, perfectly, with my hands inside hers, opened her mouth and nothing came out, because she had never known. She'd copied the steps off her phone. She'd never known about the pepper. You could watch the last of it leave her. And the producer made a phone call, quietly with her back turned, and the segment did not air again that morning the way it had been planned. Here's the aftermath, and I'm going to tell it to you straight, with the boundary I set, because this was never about cartoon revenge. The show didn't run a takedown. That's not how those places work. They protect themselves quietly. But the recipe never appeared in that book under the word original. The publisher, when their lawyers saw a notarized, photographed, 7-year-old document with my name and my grandmother's date on it, and got a voicemail, I later learned, from one Marion, leaving her phone number and the words, "I will say all of this on a record if you need me to," did what publishers do when there's a paper trail and a willing witness. They made it go away. The peach pie was pulled from the cookbook. The agent, who'd been so warm, went cold and businesslike overnight and quietly took that cropped family photo down off her website. My hand, my real arm around my grandmother, simply stopped being a problem worth keeping. The deal didn't collapse. Renee had other recipes, her own this time, and I'm not sorry that part of her dream survived, because I'm not in the business of salting fields. But Made from Scratch went to print without the one recipe it was named for. And in the front of it, in the acknowledgments, in small gray type that most people skip, there is now a line that reads, "The peach pie belongs to Della, and to my sister, who kept it. She put that there herself. Nobody made her. I'll get to that." The family, of course, had opinions. There was a stretch where I was, predictably, the villain. The bitter older sister who couldn't let Renee have one good thing, who humiliated her at the biggest moment of her life. My mother didn't speak to me for 2 months. I let her not. And the one who broke that silence was Marion. She got my mother on the phone, her own niece, and I don't know everything she said, but I know part of it because my mother repeated it to me later with her chin shaking. Marion had said, "Della told me, the last year, that she'd given the pie to the one who'd keep it kind, and that she'd made sure of it." I didn't know what she meant. Now I do. Your older girl didn't take anything from anybody. She kept the one thing your mother asked her to keep. You go thank her, or you answer to me, and I'm older than all of you. That's when my mother called. Here is the boundary I set, and I set it once. Plainly to the whole group chat, and then never again. I will love this family. I will show up for this family. But I will not pretend ever again that the things I built and kept belong to whoever in this family decides to grab them. The recipe was Grandma's, and she gave it to me to keep kind. I kept it kind for 7 years. The only person who made it ugly is the one who tried to sell it as her own. And then I put my phone down, and I made a pie, my grandmother's pie, in my own kitchen, with the real card propped against the flour bin where it belongs. I didn't make a scene. I made it clear. There's a difference, and the difference is the whole of my life. Renee came to my door about 5 months later. No camera, no apron, no audience. She stood on my porch and she cried, and this time I believed the crying because there was nothing to perform it for. She said she'd told herself a story, that she'd made it her own, that helping her once made it hers, that I didn't want it anyway because I never put myself forward. I never wanted the light. And I told her the truth, which was that not wanting the light and not deserving the credit are 2 different things, and that she'd confused my quiet for my consent the way our whole family always had. She told me, in a small voice, that the worst moment of the whole thing wasn't the producer, wasn't the publisher. It was Marion tapping that card and saying, "Watch her not know," because in that second, she'd realized she'd never actually had the pie at all. She'd only had the picture of having it. And then I did the thing that I think Grandma Della would have wanted, the thing that's harder than revenge. I asked her in, and I taught her the pie again. Properly this time, the pepper, the salt, the weeping peaches. And at the end, I gave her a copy of the card. A copy. The real one stays with me, flower-stained, where it belongs. But I wrote her a fresh card in my own hand, and at the bottom I wrote both our names, and Della's and the date, and I told her, "This is how you keep a thing kind. You write down where it came from." That acknowledgement line in her book, she added it after that afternoon. I didn't ask her to. That's how I knew something had finally landed. And the first slice of the pie we made together that day, she carried it across town, still warm, to Marion's door, and set it down in front of the one person who'd known all along it was missing the pepper. Marion tasted it and chewed slow and said, "There it is." And that, I think, was the apology that actually counted. So pull your chair back from the table with me for a second, because we're near the end now, and I want to leave you with the quiet part, the part that's mine. For most of my life, I believed that being needed was safer than being seen. I learned it at 9 on a step stool, and I practiced it for 40 years, and I'd have gone on practicing it forever. Furniture in my own family, the one who keeps things and asks for nothing. The peach pie didn't change what they thought of me overnight. People don't change that fast, and stories like to pretend they do. But something changed in me, standing at the edge of that set with a flower-stained card in my hand and an old woman's hand on my elbow. I stopped confusing my silence with peace. They are not the same thing. Silence is what you give when you've decided you don't matter enough to speak. Boundaries are what you give when you've decided you do, and that you can still love someone across a line you've finally drawn. Doors, not walls. I didn't wall my sister out of my life. I didn't burn her dream down, though I held the match and everyone would have understood if I had. I just opened a door and told her, plainly, what she'd have to leave at the threshold to walk through it. The lie, the word original, the habit of mistaking my quiet for my consent. And she left them there, eventually, and she walked through. And we are something like sisters again, realer sisters than we were when she thought she could take my grandmother's hands and stamp her name on them. For the nights the house is too quiet, I'll tell you what fills mine now. The smell of butter and warm peaches, and a card propped against the flower bin. In my grandmother's words and my own steady hand. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to lay the truth on a counter in good light in front of someone who needed it more than they wanted it? I read these. I read everyone, on the quiet nights especially. And before you go, here's the thread I'll pull next time, because there's another story I haven't told you. And it's been sitting in me a while. It's about a different kind of taking. Not a recipe, a name. A locket, actually, that went missing the week my grandmother died and turned up around someone else's neck at a wedding 11 months later, and the photograph that proved whose it really was. Marion, as it happens, knows exactly whose neck. But that's a chair for another night. Keep the porch light on for me. I'll keep it on for you. Doors, not walls. I'll see you next time.